Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Mind Matters show. Today we'll be discussing a book called The Great Leveler by a Walter Scheidel, and the rest of that title is Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. The premise of the book is that over vast numbers of centuries where we have the histories of various societies and empires and economies, that the great leveler, the only influence that has been able to distribute wealth more or less equally, or at least in a more kind of well-distributed fashion according to the standards of some, would occur when there was either some great leveling event like a massive war or famine and other influences. So I guess we'll start with, we started out reading the book recently, and I have to admit that after reading the introduction and the premise of the book, which is the idea that it's only after these kind of great societal cataclysms of war and or famine or other such disastrous events that there can be any kind of good wealth distribution among people. It's a kind of an unfortunate way of things, so the author explains. And after getting over this, this thesis, this main idea, and being actually quite impatient to see how he develops it, how he looks at the various events in history that prove that no government or system of governance has been able to distribute wealth equally, he kind of gives a broad accounting for what various societies and economic systems look like, and how it was that certain systems of political and aristocratic and elite rule have kind of thrusted themselves upon the society of the working class, of the poor, and all the mechanisms by which they redistributed and accrued all of this power and wealth to themselves. So he gives this kind of wonderful, broad example or set of examples of how this has been done over a wide array of societies. That was quite fascinating. And I found myself thinking as I was reading all of this, God, how similar are these systems and mechanisms that exist today. It's been a kind of a perennial state that humanity's lived in, between the vast inequality and power and wealth that's been held by the 1% versus the larger numbers of people who have been to one degree or another, subjugated by the elite, taxed, held in credit bondage, and it's always been that way, to greater or lesser extents, depending on how concentrated certain societies were in population, how developed they were in industry. So yeah, maybe that's a good starting point.
Well, so you mentioned the main premise of the book. We're not actually going to get into that main premise, so you pretty much just summed it up as well as possible. That the only way to achieve any kind of equitable, or the only way to re-equalize the inequalities that exist are through these massive catastrophes, essentially, historically warfare and famine, and more modern in a more modern sense. Well, actually, the warfare has been a more modern sense, like with the world wars and the great like imperial and state wars in the last several centuries. Historically, I think it was famine and state collapse, the fall of great empires. And then in the modern era, we have warfare and what was the fourth one? Oh, revolution. So, of course, all the great revolutions in the 20th century and the revolutions in the earlier too. So in the 19th, maybe even the 18th centuries, that's when revolution kind of showed what it could do. Basically, the only way to equalize wealth inequality is to bring everything down to zero and let it start up again, and then it comes through again. So that's what he talks about in the later parts of the book. We're just going to talk about like the first chapter, essentially, where he gives a history of the origin of inequality, the growth of inequality. He basically lays out a case for how inequality developed historically, and what were the things that made possible a more historically equitable distribution of resources. So maybe we can start there with the more equitable ones. So he basically says that from what can be gleaned in the historical record, that the Paleolithic societies were the most equitable. You could say hunter-gatherers, foragers have a more equitable, on the whole, distribution of resources. But he says that's for a specific, for specific and particular reasons, because first of all, these are often small tribes, so up to like a few hundred people maybe, and they're basically living at subsistence levels. So they're often nomadic, so on the move, so they can't carry a lot of personal possessions on them. So a lot of these cultures and societies didn't have, if at all, any developed idea of private property. And so a small group of people basically out for survival, and in that case, you had to share. Because you wouldn't survive if you didn't share. So some of the things that happened, or he gives several examples of existing tribes, like in the last 100 years or so, and then what can be gleaned from the historical record of what tribes 12,000 years ago and before might have been like. And from some of the modern examples, he gives the example of one African tribe, for instance, that didn't have, of course, didn't have very many personal possessions, so they might have, some clothes and a bow and arrow and some tools, mm-hmm. but they weren't very well made, and he says that they had no attachment to these items. Like, they could be stolen or broken, and it was no big deal because they just make a new one. And so things were generally shared around through the tribe. So you would have like feasts. So everyone would basically eat. Everyone contributed and everyone ate, and everyone survived. And there was how to put it? There were social rules in place to avoid inequality. So people thirsty for power and authoritarians didn't do very well, because they were acting against everyone else, and naturally those people could then gang up on that person, either shame them or use violence in order to get them back in line. And that's essentially the picture that he paints for how tribes survived to a large extent for a long period of time. But even then, he gives examples of, counterexamples. So not all foragers and hunter-gatherers were like that. For instance, there are examples from graves that have been uncovered that are like 30,000 years old. I'm not going to get into that one, Corey. Not yet. We'll get to that one. But so, for example, some children, a grave with these children who are just decked out in these elaborate clothes, essentially, with seashells and all kinds of what are called prestige items. So fancy tools and weapons and clothing. And then oftentimes in these finds, the people around them, like you find some graves where there's people who are buried with a vast amount of wealth, and then others, probably members of similar tribes or the same tribe, who are buried with very little. So there was inequality in the sense that some people had prestige, some people had a high place in the kind of social hierarchy. but they didn't necessarily. But that didn't necessarily mean that that there were starving people in the tribe, for instance. You can't go that far. There was inequality, but it wasn't necessarily as stark in terms of wealth as later societies, and we'll get into those a bit later. But going back even further, he starts out the first chapter, this history of inequality, by looking at like apes and chimpanzees, and basically showing, basically what Jordan Peterson says a lot when he's talking about dominance hierarchies, that these kind of tribal animals, tribal mammals, have an acute sense of hierarchy, and it is a constant battle for social position. So essentially, each member of the chimp tribe or whatever it is knows on some level what his place is, and is constantly trying to get a bit higher up in the social hierarchy, and that is primarily controlled through violence. So the dominant the alpha male basically can control a lot of sub-males, the betas or the gammas, through the threat of violence. And but again, like Peterson shows, there's even evidence in the animal world of like coalition building and sharing. So these other methods of gaining social worth and value within the tribe that are then looked upon as leaders, in a sense, people worth following, or animals worth following. That kind of carries into humanity. There are several things about humans, though, that mitigate the role that violence played, or the threat of violence, because that's not exactly correct. Mitigated the size and like the physical strength of the alphas, because with humans we can speak and we're smart. At least that's how we like to think of ourselves. Smarter than
those filthy apes.
Yeah. And so. Yeah, and we're also able to fashion tools and weapons. So some of the things that what he calls the first great, how does he call it? The first great great equalization, or something like that. I can't remember what his exact term for it was, but basically it was all of these things that made us human that mitigated those more like ape-like displays of dominance. And so because we could talk, we could communicate, we could now form real coalitions. And because of the use of like projectile weapons, so stones and spears, and just if you can throw something at someone else, if they're stronger than you and you're 10 feet away, you can throw something at them and either kill them or incapacitate them. So that elevated skill to to a higher level than just brute strength. Because if you're smart, and if you're smart and you can create allies and gain allies for yourself, you can have a lot more power, a lot more social standing than just a super strong alpha male, for instance. So that mitigated the more mammalian examples of inequality and hierarchy, and basically leveled things out a bit. But even then, there's always this inequality of one sort or the other. So there's always this social standing, for instance. But in a lot of these foraging tribes, for instance, they don't have. There's not a political structure so much. Like there aren't always identifiable leaders that hold a position for any great period of time. It cycles back and forth. People take those positions and cycle in and out of those positions among the tribe. But even then, like I mentioned, it's not like all foragers are these, or were these kind of utopian equal societies. There were several things that would influence that too. For example, if you happen to be living on a river, or basically with maritime access to a resource like fish, that would establish basically a scarcity of resources. And in a lot of hunter-gatherer tribes, there wasn't necessarily much scarcity of resources, because you didn't need much. You just needed enough to eat and survive, and that could be shared around the tribe relatively easily. When you have a more scarce resource, so a number of tribes, for instance, battling for control over a single source of fish. That creates the impetus and the need for control of that resource. And so that's where you get the start of separate classes, or the emergence of classes within a tribal structure like that. So you start getting chiefs who have basically harems and slaves. And so even in some of these foraging cultures, you had inequality of that sort with actual slavery and the kind of monopolistic control of a resource that creates class divisions and inequalities of that sort, and then not only within the tribe, but of course between the tribes too. So then, of course, you have to take into account tribal warfare, and one of the main themes that stuck out to me from this kind of really condensed history of like 30,000 years of inequality is the role of violence, both in equality and inequality, because it is the threat of violence that early on created the conditions for a more equitable distribution of status and resources, but it's also the practice and the threat of violence that especially later on with the introduction of agriculture, allowed for vastly more unequal structures in human societies. So maybe we can get, or did you want to say anything about that, or do we want to get into some agrarian stuff? Because, well, it's essentially, so until the Younger Dryas, we talked about that when we were doing our show on Graham Hancock's book, Before America. Around that time, after the Younger Dryas, that's the first time in the historical record that we find the emergence of agriculture. So in the Near East, basically in Mesopotamia, in Anatolia, in like southern China, in South America, within a few thousand years, agriculture developed in all these different areas, and that was kind of the first condition for the explosion of inequality on the world scene, because Scheidel basically says or argues that probably the most important condition for the creation of inequality and wealth is surplus production. Because, like I mentioned, in the hunter-gatherer tribes, they didn't need much, and couldn't have much because they were on the move. That you can't carry a lot around with you when you're traveling from place to place hunting and tracking the movements of animals and trying to find hunting grounds. Essentially, you need a relatively static geographic location of your living quarters, and the surplus production of food, essentially in this case primarily grains. Once that happens, now you've got more than you need. And what happens when you have more than you need? Well, this is where I think the moral and ethical argument comes in, because you have to keep it into account. You have to keep it in mind, because like when you hear talk about inequality these days, it's usually, inequality is getting worse, and it's a bad thing, and that's where the discussion ends. It's just inequality is bad, and we need to do something about it. Well, the response, I've got like a couple of responses to that. First, if Scheidel is right, there's nothing you can really do about it, because it'll always be there in one form or another, and at a certain level, there's nothing you can do to get inequality below a certain level. It'll always be there. On the other hand, like Scheidel mentions, inequality at certain levels can be arguably a bad thing. That probably even the right wingers who are don't really care about anyone that doesn't make as much money as them. Even they might. Well, he would argue he's got an argument for why even they should agree that inequality can be a bad thing. For one, he quotes some studies that show that the vast disparity in wealth actually slows economic growth and can have bad effects on the economy. economies do worse off when there are vast inequalities. But there's also just the moral argument of whether it is right or wrong, or if it's not even a moral question, whether or what the moral status of inequality is. It's like,
right. Well, I think there's a good point to be made there between maybe a distinction between ethical inequality and unethical inequality, or earned inequality and unearned, or whatever, unethical inequality that would basically be. He points out the extreme, like one person owns everything, right, and everyone else cannot survive, and that person just gloats over them. And so that's clearly one example of inequality. But then there's another one, and I can't remember if he brings it up or if I remember Jordan Peterson bringing it up, but it's Price's Law, which it was created to identify why so many people in the academic field published so many papers, a large percentage, a disproportionate number of the papers in that field, as compared to the rest of their peers. And so this gentleman, Price, I can't remember his name, but he came up with a law that says that 50% of the work is done by the square root of the total number of people who participate in the work. And this has been borne out like time and time again. It just seems to be a mathematical aspect of human life. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of the 80-20 rule, which says that 20% of your customers constitute 80% of your profit, or something along those lines. But so if you have 100 people in a tribe, that means that 10 people are doing 50% of the work, and then the rest are doing the other 90% of the work. And it could be due to all different sorts of reasons, just skill, character. You have leaders, you have all sorts of things that could constitute what would eventually become an unequal share. I put in more work, I get more. And then you can say, well, okay, that's fine to some degree. Everybody is in a small group like that, you can get away with making those kinds of deals, with understanding why there is inequality. The chief, he's big man. He gets the first share, but he deserves it. He earns it. He is the father figure, whatever, for the whole tribe. Now, on the other hand, there's also more unequal and unethical distributions that that now it all gets lumped into the 1%. It just doesn't look good when you have whatever 1% of the people who own half of the wealth. But as it's been pointed out, we don't know why it is that way. We can't say. Nobody has the power to make that happen. There's some natural element to it that, it just happens over and over and over again throughout history. For example, Scheidel writes that, so have the rich simply kept getting richer? Not quite. For all the much maligned rapacity of the billionaire class, or more broadly, the 1%, American top income shares only very recently caught up with those reached back in 1929, and assets are less heavily concentrated now than they were then. In England, on the eve of the First World War, the richest tenth of households held a staggering 92% of all private wealth, crowding out pretty much everybody else. Today, their share is a little more than half. And 2,000 years ago, the largest Roman private fortunes equaled about 1.5 million times the average annual per capita income in the empire, roughly the same ratio as for Bill Gates and the average American today. He concludes by saying, for thousands of years, civilization did not lend itself to peaceful equalization. Across a wide range of societies and different levels of development, stability favored economic inequality. This was as true of pharaonic Egypt as it was of Victorian England, as true of the Roman Empire as of the United States. Mm-hmm. And as you said before, Harrison, you touched a little bit on the specific reasons why, and it seems like it's due primarily the two crucial determinants of inequality are ownership rights in land and livestock, and the ability to transmit that wealth from one generation to the next. Has been pointed out a million times. Nobody starts in the same spot. When you're born, you start from a whatever disadvantage because of your ancestors. If you just going back in time, the cumulative choices, the different pressures and stuff. A lot of the stuff just happens by accident, and people, you look at that and it doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair that your great grandparents were born into slavery, and then a few generations later they were still struggling to make it in society because of whatever issues. And so it's clearly it's not fair. But it is something that has been repeated time and time again throughout history. And if you're really serious about the issue, you have to look at the facts, and you have to understand the gravity of the situation. You can't just say, well, inequality is evil, inequality is bad, so whatever, so now let's do something about it. Now that we've said that it's bad, let's do something about it.
Well, taking that a bit further, I think there is an argument to be, I think on the one hand, like you're saying, it's hard to say that inequality is just bad, just categorically bad, because we don't even, like you said, we don't even understand why it is a recurring phenomenon. It seems to just be like inbuilt into nature to some degree. Again, comparing it to the Paleolithic societies, there was inequality of a sort. And that could have been as simple as skill or just social prestige. It might not have translated to a great degree into just how much food you got to eat, but there was a type of inequality. Now, for the past 10,000 years, there's been a different type of inequality, like a new type of inequality that has been brought about because of the production of a surplus of primarily food. That was the big driver of the large increase in inequality in those years. So now we can ask, well, what do we say about that? It could be that inequality is an inescapable thing, not neither good nor bad, and sometimes good, sometimes bad, depending on the situation. But there may be an inherent evil in a certain type of inequality when we look at it, and so. It may be that like at a certain when you're just looking at like a graph, for instance, it may be if you could have all the information to plot a perfect graph, because even like all of the graphs that Scheidel and the historians and economists working on this come up with, even in their graphs there are problems with the data. Like I know Nicholas Nassim Taleb is a big critic of Gini coefficients because, according to him, the outliers, because of the sample of examples that you use in compiling your data, if you just miss one or two outliers, that could have a huge effect on your Gini coefficient. Gini is like the statistical number that they use to show a type of like wealth disparity in societies. So it goes from 0 to 1, 0 being the most equal and 1 being the most unequal. And so I think the United States currently is at about 0.5 or something like that. And some of the Paleolithic societies are down in like 0.2 or lower. And some agrarian societies can get as high as like 0.6 or 0.7, maybe even higher. I don't know, can't remember. But just as a matter of like the randomness of the data available, it could be that ancient societies were a lot more unequal than we think, just because we don't have access to those one or two outliers in the tail end of the distribution that will change the whole number. But anyway, so even accounting for that, if we had all the information and could come up with this, it may, and just looking at it, it may be like, okay, well, here's kind of natural inequality. If we just let people do their things, and they can even be behaving in what we would consider, according to our modern morality, like decent ways, it could be that if you add some other thing into the equation, you get bigger inequalities. And what I'm thinking about specifically is this phenomenon that Scheidel talks about in the history of agriculture, is that the agriculture seems to have, along with agriculture, inevitably came the creation of like power elites, these new classes of people that didn't exist previously, and that gained a huge amount of that surplus. And like reading through history, not just Scheidel's book, but any history. If you're looking at the history of the ancient Near East, or even like colonial America, you just find a lot of what you would consider nowadays like base criminality. These are just like basically mafia thugs just shaking people down for their money, like protection rackets. Like, you pay me and I'll protect you. And that has pretty much been the history of power elites. Otherwise, nowadays known as governments and mafias, like people that just shake down the people under their control through the threat of violence in order to get stuff for themselves. And so he's got this, like, I was really intrigued by his description of like the growth of elite classes and the methods that they used to like keep their positions. And so he basically says that like societies were unequal at this point, and they got even more unequal because of essentially the predations of this elite class on everyone else. And he basically just like, I'd recommend reading it just for his description of like of the powerful and leaders. And like when you read about it, it makes sense. Like all these decisions make sense. It's like, okay, well, I can see how and why that happened. It's like you get this surplus production, you get like even just a group of families that are then out to protect what they produced. That has created this level of inequality. And then like one of the things about goods and private property is that it's defensible. That means you can defend it against outsiders. You can store grain, but that means you need the creation of like an organized like group of violent people to protect it. And just through that, now you have more money, and then it's kind of like the typical anti-capitalist, anti-monopoly argument that the more that person acquires, the more they can acquire with what they already have. Mm-hmm. And so their wealth just kind of rises exponentially. Well, there's a limit to how much wealth can be gained by any one person, but maybe we'll get into that in a second. But so you have the creation now of these elite classes, and with the rise of states, now you have leaders who, or the rise of empires. You have the leaders of these empires who now have to control these geographic regions. Well, one of the characteristics of ruling, of leadership, historically and arguably today, is the delegation of leadership authority. You have to delegate and give people power to be able to then like protect like the king or the emperor's power. He has to give other people power in order to keep his own power. And that creates, again, that expands the elite class. And how do you give that, or what are the perks that you give this person in order to defend, your claim to the throne, essentially? Well, you give them wealth and land, and now they're protecting their own property, the property that the leader has given them, often by stealing it from someone else. And so you get this entrenched kind of system of just organized theft, which is, and then it is kept in place through taxation and rents. So the money you can make off your land and the money that you get as a state official, and there is incentive now because incentive and precedent for now further expanding your wealth through any means necessary. And that's the history of government and elite classes, is just getting as much as possible through any means possible. And whether through warfare, warfare is a good example, like the way that war promotes inequalities. Essentially, one group of people attacks the others, enslaves them, so now gets free labor and gets all their stuff. Mm-hmm. So the ruling class now has all of that, and those people that were conquered now have nothing. Mm-hmm. And not only have nothing, are now slaves themselves. So, their own selves have been stolen.
Yes, and if you don't think that this exact dynamic and paradigm doesn't exist today in some similar form, then what can I say? You haven't been reading Sot, because what we're seeing in the wars of the Middle East, acquiring influence in Afghanistan over the the vast mineral deposits, the oil in Syria, et cetera, subjugating through sanctions and various other policies that have kept the kind of sovereign impetus among many people down to a certain level, or it's an attempt to. This is a perpetual state of affairs, and he seems to be making the point that once a nation moves into this kind of imperial paradigm, it becomes very hard to turn back the clock, to regulate it, to reform it. And he gives several examples of this, one of which I found kind of interesting. He writes, from early on, the ongoing acquisition and concentration of private wealth in elite circles caused certain concerns for rulers who needed to protect primary producers, who were expected to pay taxes and perform labor services for the state, from predatory lenders and domineering landlords. From the mid-3rd to the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian kings periodically decreed cancellation of debts in an attempt to slow the advance of private capital. For all we know, this was bound to be a losing battle. A telling illustration of these tensions can be found in the, quote, Song of Release, a Hurrian myth translated into Hittite in the 15th century BCE. It features the Hurrian weather god Tasub, who appears in the city council of Ebla in northwestern Syria in the guise of a debtor, visibly in dire need and, quote, dried out. King Megi has clashed with the city's powerful notables over the release of debt slaves, a measure deemed required by divine command but successfully opposed by Zazala, a gifted orator who sways opinion in the elite council. Under his influence, the counselors offer Tasub gifts of gold and silver if he is in debt, oil if he is dried out, and fuel if he is cold, but refuse to free the enslaved debtors in accordance with Megi's wishes. Quote, but we will make no release of slaves. There will be no rejoicing in your soul, O Megi. They invoke the necessity of keeping debtors in bondage, for if we were to release them, who would give us to eat? On the one hand, they are our cupbearers. On the other, they serve food to us. They are our cooks, and they wash up for us. So there's this sense that quite often you have a leader who does want to equalize the situation on the ground for many of his people, but you have these gifted orators. You have, in our day and age, propagandists and politicians who argue eloquently for their position and sway whole groups of their population and people in positions of power to not reform things. We've seen that situation in Imperial Rome, where there was this constant tension between the populares and the Senate to redistribute the wealth, to give the lower merchant class more money, more access to food, more access to land. And there was always among the Senate and the old school, the old guard, this attempt to keep the reins on power and to crush this kind of equalizing force with whatever means were necessary. So they would form coalitions in order to squelch the kind of impetus for greater equality. But when that threat was alleviated, they would squabble among themselves for the spoils, and there would be an incredible amount of infighting among them, which include incredible acts of violence and assassination, and really just the kind of the kind of lateral movement of huge sums of wealth and land and slaves from one oligarch to the other, almost always with this, with this force that was pushing down upon the greater masses of people who were either slaves or freed slaves or merchants who were looking for their piece of the pie.
Well, I think that's really interesting that you bring up the kind of the attitude of these oligarchs. It sounds to me a lot like something we've discussed on the show, previous shows, is the schizoidal declaration, the idea that people are so bad, their nature is so horrible that they have to be kept in check, have to be kept in thrall by some supreme force, and so you have to keep them enslaved, you have to keep them in debt, you have to keep them in bondage of, some kind or another. But I mean, really what it is just a rationalization for your own laziness. You're the rentier class, you just deserve it just because you are so special. And that's clearly, a theme that runs throughout history, is that idea. But when you look at, human nature, I mean, it just seems natural that we have such a variegated psychology, so much potential to be, different people. And we're also very hive-like too, like we want to specialize. People want to go and become something. That's kind of, that puritanical calling or whatever, the Protestant ethic, that your calling in the world is to do some kind of work and to specialize in it and to do work well. And that ethic runs completely counter to such a thing. It's like, people don't need to be kept in absolute slavery, bondage. That's kind of the capitalist ethic, is that, no, let people go out, choose their work, and the whole system will kind of sort itself out on its own. The people who should get what they, people will get what they deserve. That's the hope. That's the hope behind that. And it's interesting to me how demonized that, capitalism is, when in fact it's a little bit different than that system that we're talking about that's been going on for centuries, because it hasn't been a competence hierarchy. Humanity hasn't lived in competence hierarchies like that for a long time. You read this book and a lot of it sounds like what you guys are saying, the elite, this elite rentier class basically gets to make deals. They know the right people, the politicians, you are a politician. And that still goes on to this day. There's still clearly, not everything is organized in terms of competence. But more and more people are, trying to do such things. And I mean, billions of people in China, lifted out of poverty, utilizing such schemes, trying to organize things competently and effectively to get people to kind of bridge the gap, rather than, they just deserve their position because they are slaves and they're in the lower class, when, as I said before, all of those things are just, fundamentally, who knows? It's just the roulette wheel of the universe. Wherever you're born into some position or you're born into another position.
Well, you mentioned the schizoidal declaration that human nature is so bad that people need to be controlled by a strong government, essentially. I think that you could make a reverse declaration. From my reading, this is kind of what I would call the libertarian declaration, is that human nature is so bad that a system of government should be set up that no one can achieve like the level of power that governments have. Maybe even governments should be abolished in some sort. At least that would be like the anarchist libertarian position, that there should be no government because governments are essentially evil. But human nature is so bad that a system, let's say a societal system, should be set up so that no one can achieve that level of power over other people, and power and coercion, and be able to use violence and the threat of violence to violate other people, and their property. So that would be like the capitalist version. It's like you have the kind of almost but not quite communist hunter-gatherer societies, because they weren't communist. Like Scheidel argues. And then you've got the rentier class capitalism, you could call it, of power elites who are essentially got there through no talent of their own and through just the exercise of brute power and the violence and the threat of violence. And then you've got this like what I'd consider more of a larger society-based economic system, so that is more appropriate for like the modern age through what we are essentially, an agrarian, like surplus-based economy. There's no getting out of that at this point, aside from a catastrophe that puts us back to Paleolithic conditions. Of inequality, there will be inequality in such a system, but it's kind of I wouldn't say the best of both worlds, but it's at least somewhere in between. Somewhere in between the vast inequalities that are created through theft and violence and the equalities that are only able to be found in small communities. There's got to be something in between, because we don't live in small communities. We don't live in tribes anymore. Mm-hmm. We're never going to get there, aside from people that voluntarily choose to do so and to create their own communities, mm-hmm. Communes, intentional communities, those sorts of things. Aside from those people, there's got to be another way, essentially. And I think that's what a lot of the idealists, whether from the left or like the libertarian left or right, that's what they're searching for. I think everyone who rails against the 1% has some idea that there's something wrong with society as it is now, but I don't think they quite get what the problem is. They might identify some symptoms of the problem, some actual problems, but I think that overall it's very misguided and simplistic. It's like if you're railing against just inequality as such, that's a losing battle. Mm-hmm. Like you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to make things worse by pursuing that as your like rallying cry. It's not going to get anywhere. But there may be certain aspects of the economic and social and moral systems that we have today that would be more effective if tackled head on. And like, who knows? It might be as simple as paring things down to, like in a capitalist economy, paring things down to a very well-defined system of like property rights, for instance. It's like if you were able to enforce certain like property rights and laws, that might actually be a very effective way of redistributing wealth, because there's a lot of wealth that is ill-gotten. For instance, if you could just take all the wealth that was gotten by theft and give it back to the people it was stolen from, and I'm not just talking about like rich people that make money and it's like, oh, that's my money, that rich person has stolen it from me. No, like actually really getting down to the nitty-gritty and finding, oh, well, where did that money come from? It's like, did you actually steal that according to these, legal principles that we've developed? Was that ill-gotten money? And if it was, like that in itself might cut off like a large portion of the vast inequality of wealth, that's within the 1%. Who knows? I'm not an economist and I haven't developed this, but it's like there's got to be something better than just, okay, now we're going to tax everyone, 70%, take all this money, and then just we'll redistribute it now. Because there's so many problems inherent in that. It's like you are. Well, it's the problem that part of the problem is what Scheidel talks about just power elites. Mm-hmm. For any government, do you want any government to have the power to take that much money from the population? And what are they going to do with it? It's like, because the history of elite classes is that you shouldn't trust them with your money.
Yeah.
Because they're going to do, first of all, they're not going to manage it very well. They're going to waste it because they didn't do anything to earn it. Like, that's the problem with bureaucrats, is that they get paid with other people's money to do something, and they have no incentive to do a good job at it because they're going to get that money whether they do a good job or not. And that's the problem with politicians. Politicians have absolutely zero skin in the game. They have no incentive to get things right. Their only incentive is to convince people to vote for them. And it doesn't matter what their record is, how effective they are at actually doing something right.
And more often than not, they leave office far richer than when they came in.
Right.
But your point reminds me of the 23 or 24 trillion dollars that the Pentagon is largely can't account for.
Yep.
And you stop and think about the mind-boggling amount of money that's been siphoned off of American taxpayers that's unaccounted for. That has gone into all kinds of black projects that we only have hints at in the news. Space programs, underground bases, arms, exotic arms, and all kinds of projects that are that have effectively made the people who are in the industry of making arms and manufacturing various things very, very rich secretly. And you stop and think, so there's this incredible concentration of, you can call it elite industrial military magnates who have managed to, through their connivances and skill at manipulation, to gather all of this money right under the noses of the 300 million American citizens. I forget the number of American citizens, but that's effectively what's happened. And until we can figure out a way to counteract the kind of pathological greed that is informed by the behavior of these individuals who have managed this incredible sleight of hand, it seems to me that the best we can do, because we'll never get to the point where there's a critical mass of people, I think, who really understand the level of criminality that exists. And that's just in that part of that's just one industry. The banking industry is another. Big pharma is another. The food industry is another. Energy sector is another. I mean, these are all interlocking elite mechanisms for siphoning off vast amounts of wealth and life's blood from the working class. So we are at a distinct disadvantage. And what is the answer to that? Well, Corey, you posed a question a little bit ago, or at least it raised some questions in my mind about the few approaches that people can take to realizing, the vast inequality. One is they can rail about it and bitch about it and hold up banners and get angry. And I guess that's purposeful up to a point if it raises awareness of a certain issue. But there's certainly a toxic level of resentment that doesn't do a person any good. And then there's another approach, I think. A friend of mine was once telling me about her landlord, who was a wonderful man, who was an entrepreneur, an innovator, an inventor, employed 30 people, rented the apartment that she lived in with her son and daughter at a very reasonable rate, beautiful place, well-maintained. And he also had a kind of place in their lives, too. He was a friend to them because that's who he was. He took responsibility for other people. He, all the while, was a fairly wealthy guy. He was able to do both. He was able to be a kind of a caretaker for people who were less innovative and less savvy than he was. and also live a very comfortable life. And I thought, why can't we strive for that as an ideal among ourselves? It must have been, by the description of this man, I've never met him, it must have been a very gratifying existence for him to be an innovator, to accrue wealth and comfort in his life, but to work hard and to see to it on a personal level that the people who rented from him lived as happy a life in the dwelling that he rented out to them as they could possibly have. How the hell does a person, how does a person achieve that kind of life? That's what I'd like to know. Right. I've always been working class. I've always, banged my head against the wall for a few shekels. And I would like to, as an ideal, work towards that more kind of, that wonderful example of this gentleman who my friend described to me.
Right. I think that's actually a really great point, because what you're talking about is like really a fundamental distinction between like just an attitude shift if you want to fight inequality, that I think that it's really important. It has to come from some place within, where you're not wanting to fight inequality because you want to be the rich guy, because you're a materialistic swine just like everybody else, but you want to fight the unethical aspects of inequality, and you want to live in a way that makes life better for other people, that you want to be effective, you want to be competent, you want to make life easier for other people, you don't want to make it, miserable, you want to live for other people. That's how you judge your life, basically, is the impact that you have on other people. And that's this big thing, because when you think about these materialistic, elites and, the life they live, I don't envy them one bit. No. Look at Barack Obama when he comes out of office. He looks like he's just aged 700 years. Mm-hmm. He looks like a lich, he looks like some undead thing coming out of office, or like, so many people they look like robots. There's no joy in their life, because at that level, it's hard to live at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. You're a mess. Life is horrible. You never know if you're going to have a meal or whatever, right? But then at the top, it's like the exact opposite. I guess they just function like they're on cocaine or meth. They just have some, biochemically, it seems like we're just hardwired, and we have been ever since, we first found out that we could, convince everybody that we deserve everything. we deserve to live like kings, that, we're just biochemically hardwired to just pump full of just these horrible drugs that turn you into, like sociopaths I don't even know if I'd be any different if I was born into some uber rich, household, and went to all the right schools and went through all of the, the ivory tower, indoctrination, and, your whole goal in your life is to cheat the other guys who are trying to cheat your family. Mm. And, how can you scam your way through the tax system, and let's write up an income tax code so that we can get, as much money as we can, and this and that. It's this whole, what do they call it? The Hall of Mirrors, where you just get sucked into this narcissistic, delusional, self-focused prison of your own self, and you end up like, you end up like one of them. Yeah. Well, we learned that lesson like thousands of years ago. We know that's not what life is all about. That's not where you find the meaning in life. There's an entirety of the universe out there that a whole other half of the universe that isn't just selfish and narcissistic like that. And it's really adopting that attitude, I think, where you can actually start a successful, whatever successful in your own little life, way to fight the real dramatic the inequalities that plague all of us, because we're all jerks. We all live in this pecking order. We all do those kinds of things. It's
well, first of all, amen, brother. and secondly, I think I think that that was a good display of humility too, and something that has also been one of the lessons of Jordan Peterson, that any one of us can succumb to this deep narcissistic selfishness that seeks to cut out those around us and those below us at their expense, largely at their expense. And there is another way, but it is dependent upon us to see how that to see that possibility and to manifest it and to make it real, and to also be kind of painfully aware of the fact that we could at any time be behaving in a way that that seeks to, raise ourselves in the most arrogant, selfish, and really destructive way, especially to those around us. Gurdjieff, talks about the abivatel, the very kind of basic standard of personhood that would be able to support 30 people if necessary. Now he's talking about subsistence levels, I think, if I remember correctly. But that's that there is an attempt there to say, if you're really responsible and thinking about others, then as a kind of standard for being a good human being, at the very least, you should be able to support 30 people. And, that's 30 people is a lot of people. That's a lot of mouths to feed. That's a lot of beds and clothing and other things.
And you need money to do that.
And you do. You need to have a way to make that money.
Mm-hmm. Right. And right there you have an inequality, right? Mm-hmm. But it's completely different from the kinds of inequality that people will rail against.
Right.
But still, it's an inequality. So we can't just make a blanket statement saying that all inequality is evil and bad. We have to be realistic.
Right. So what you said in your previous statement, Corey, you'd said something like we should fight the unethical aspects of inequality. You could pare that down even further, leave inequality out of the equation. Just fight bad ethics, fight what amounts to immoral and unethical behavior, essentially what should be illegal behavior, based on whatever can be enforced, whether there's a legal system or if it's in a small tribe, just the social code of that tribe, enforce the good behavior, the good and the bad behavior, like make those distinctions and then enforce them. But the systems, our systems aren't set up in such a way, or if it's been attempted to set them up that way, people are very good at finding the loopholes. Mm-hmm. And so, I'll read something from the book. He's talking about the rise of these elite classes. And so Scheidel writes of the ways in which it's easy to appreciate how the defining features of pre-modern state formation, just outlined, would have influenced economic activity in peculiar ways. So he's talking about how these features of state formation and the elite class actually impact economies. So he writes, political integration not only helped expand markets and lowered at least some transaction and information costs, the pervasive power asymmetries that commonly characterized pre-modern polities all but ensured an uneven playing field for economic actors. Fragile property rights, inadequate rule enforcement, arbitrary exercise of justice, the venality of state agents, and the paramount importance of personal relationships and proximity to sources of coercive power were among the factors likely to skew outcomes in favor of those in the upper reaches of the status pyramid and those profitably connected to them. So it's like that's the problem. It's like the problem isn't inequality. The problem isn't even some people making more money or having more wealth than others. It's like I'm sure we've talked about it on previous shows about like surveys that are done, and like people at the bottom level of the economic spectrum don't hate rich people. They hate a particular type of rich people. Mm-hmm. pretty much everyone is fine with a certain type of inequality. If there's a billionaire and they think, well, wow, that guy worked to get there, they're fine with it. They couldn't care. Like they'll buy his records if he's a musician, or read his books if he's a writer, or buy his products if he's got a company that produces something like that. It's like no problem, and they might even look up to him. But if they find out that someone is just a thief, like running Ponzi schemes or something, like they'll have no respect for him, and they'll want to see him taken down. That's where the resentment comes in to a large degree, is seeing someone above their station. And that's what Lobachevsky talks about the upward and downward adjustment. It's like especially when you are a person, a talented person, who's in a position, like a very low position, like not below what you would be capable of, and you see someone who is below your level of competence in a position of extreme authority or large authority, that rubs you the wrong way. That rubs people the wrong way. And that's what creates like revolutionary sentiments among people. But just having a boss, people don't naturally just hate their bosses because they're bosses. They hate their bosses if they're bad bosses. If you've got a good boss, then you're fine. It's like you might even respect that person.
Well, I'd like to qualify that a little bit, Harrison, because what we've been seeing today in Western society and Western culture is a group of people who hate their bosses because they're the bosses.
Right.
These are the ones who say, I can spell hamster with a P. And it's...
You can't.
and so it's... it's one of the reasons I think we're even discussing inequality today, in addition to the fact that this, Scheidel lays out the history of inequality and how it's been changed or not changed and by what factors, is that you do have a people, a certain segment of the population that is now thinking outside of this, what may be deserved wealth and inequality, and want the power and want the wealth by mere fact of them wanting it, and without any kind of deservedness, if that's a word, or earned earned wealth or capacity. And I'm sure that many of the people that you mentioned who don't resent people accruing wealth are probably the working class, the people who have very naturally healthy attitudes towards making a living and being responsible for themselves, if not families, and who have a kind of a range of moral taste buds that's in the healthier spectrum of people who are stratified in this system of wealth inequality.
Well, there's another thing to mention, and that's kind of be careful what you wish for, because inequality, as he points out in the book, has been leveled quite a number of times in the past, but it's typically by very lethal and horrifying events. So if you hate inequality, then don't worry, it probably won't last that long.
Yeah. Well, I want to read a few quotes, just some interesting bits before we wrap up today. I mentioned earlier that there was a grave that was dug, and I said we'd talk about it later, so I'll read that one just because it's quite humorous. Okay, so
this is Harrison in his past life.
No, a cemetery at Varna by the Black Sea, in what is now Bulgaria, has yielded more than 200 occupied graves from the 5th millennium BCE. One burial stands out. A middle-aged man laid to rest with no fewer than 990 gold objects, weighing more than 3 pounds total. He was covered in gold ornaments that were probably attached to his original clothing, carried heavy gold rings around his arms, and wielded an axe scepter. Even his penis was sheathed in gold. This man's grave accounts for a third of all gold objects associated or found at this site, and a quarter of their total weight. Grave goods are very unevenly distributed overall. More than half of the occupied graves contain some goods, but fewer than 1 in 10 is rich in deposits. and only a handful contain a wide range of materials, including lots of gold. The Gini coefficient for the number of goods per grave varies from 0.61 to 0.77. That's really high on the Gini scale, depending on the period, but would be much higher if we could adjust the distribution for value. Just a comment on the Gini scale, I think it's in the appendix, Scheidel points out that you can't in practice get a Gini scale that goes up to 1. There's always a limit to the amount of inequality that a society can sustain before it collapses, essentially. Or the only way it's just not sustainable, because once you get to a certain Gini coefficient for essentially your GDP, or the amount of money each person has, there's a subsistence level of Gini coefficient. So past a certain level, people start dying, because they don't have any money, they don't have any food, and at that point, that you can't sustain the inequality, because the rich people can't sustain their wealth when everyone's dying around them, and that comes into that's why famine and warfare are levelers. For instance, tons of people die, and the economy just can't sustain itself under those levels. Everything and everyone just drops down to zero. You have to start over again. So when people are talking about the rising wealth disparities in various countries, they can only go so high, and there's historically there are even reasons for keeping inequality at a certain level, because essentially you need your slaves basically to live in order to make stuff for you, and that transfers over even into modern economies. It's if all of the employees of big corporations started dying, the corporations would start being like, okay, we need to pay them more. They wouldn't just let everyone die. Essentially, roughly.
So in other words, I think one of the big takeaways from what we've been discussing so far is you can't take it with you. And for all the elitists out there...
Not even your golden penis sheath.
No. Took the words out of my mouth. Your success is in many ways dependent upon the success and the relative equality of those around you, and arguably, would make for an even richer, more meaningful life if it's in your thinking or being to consider such notions, to help those around you.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that's the only thing you can take with you, I think, is the meaningful impact of your life. You're the guy with the golden sheath and all that stuff. I mean, he's just a joke now.
Yes.
Maybe he was a great guy, but I highly doubt it. He was probably a petty tyrant, and everyone was like, God, he's wearing the sheath again. This is, but yeah, I firmly believe that, if that's probably the only thing that you can take with you is the meaningful impact that you had on other people. So, all of that other stuff aside.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just one thing to keep in mind when, if just hearing the word inequality makes you, want to start a revolution and kill some bankers, to read some history, read this book and just consider how much worse things were, even 1,000, 3,000 years ago, where basically not everywhere, but in certain societies, where the elite class literally had everything, or what amounts to everything, and everyone else was at the very bottom, just living bare subsistence. Mm-hmm. It's and that's essentially, today that would apply to everyone in extreme poverty today. It's there are a lot of very rich people. There's a huge global middle class, and then there are still several millions, I don't know the number, hundreds of millions of people living on less than essentially $1 a day. But consider yourself, if you're a university student, just think about how rich you are compared to those people that are alive today, and compared to what people, what your ancestors were living through thousands of years ago under some, feudal overlord who was, doing all sorts of unspeakable things and stealing your rightful property.
Yeah, you bring up a really funny point there, because you're a university student on this basically a resort, a vacation, and you're complaining about the hardships.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, on that note, everybody, we appreciate you listening today, and we look forward to revisiting The Great Leveler and expanding on some of the ideas that he presents. This is just the beginning, I think, of our kind of discussions on this book. And have a wonderful week. And we look forward to having a show with Corey and Harrison very soon again, and presenting some new, insightful, hopefully, and interesting material that you can take away, and that'll be a movable feast, and that you can enjoy and recommend to all your family and friends.
Hit like and subscribe.
All right. See you, everyone.